Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for having me here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll apologize for not speaking German. I'm one of those few Dutch people who is not mastering the German language, so you'll have to forgive me. Paul has asked me to talk about business models today, which is a topic of interest of mine. I already detected that that is a topic that you have debated yesterday. Before I start, I think it's important to mention one thing. The discussion around business models, I think too often, is going in the wrong direction. Business model is a term that is derived from the business environment, and if we talk about cultural heritage, we should be very, very careful that we don't just adopt the language and throw that on the things that we're doing here. I think Pavel mentioned that the average time spent looking at a picture in a museum is 11 seconds. I mean, it's that type of thing that we need to be careful about. It's not about the number of seconds that people spend doing anything. As an example, I spent yesterday some time, an hour and a half, at the Holocaust Memorial, and I had an incredibly moving time there. It's an incredible object. It's a memorial that you can't be but moved. And I was especially moved because it was not just about the horrible history of the Holocaust, but you saw children, you know, this age, immediately playing hide and seek and having a fantastic time there. And I think if we can do a little bit of that in a digital environment, then I think we're creating the value that business models are all about. So before you think that I'm going to talk a lot about what kind of revenue models are possible with digital heritage, you know, that to me is a very fundamental principle that we need to keep in mind. It's about value creation from within, from the cultural heritage institutions that you represent. So that's just a starting point. I have a little movie to show you. That's the only thing you'll hear from me in German, but it is in German, so I'm quite happy about that. Let's see.
Linked Open Data, was ist das eigentlich? Und warum ist es für Sie als Gedächtnisinstitution interessant? Versetzen Sie sich doch in die Lage Ihres Benutzers. Nehmen wir an, Sie möchten etwas über das Gemälde herausfinden, in dem Venus auf einer Muschel steht. Sie werden wahrscheinlich nach dem Wort Venus suchen. Sie werden jede Menge Treffer erhalten. Venus, Venus, Venus und schlussendlich werden Sie die richtige Venus gefunden haben. Auf einer einzelnen Webseite. Aber was wäre, wenn das Webservice Ihnen von Anfang an helfen könnte? Zuerst, indem es Sie unterstützt, Ihre Suchanfrage eindeutig zu stellen und dann, indem es Ihnen allerlei relevante Informationen anbietet und das in Echtzeit und innerhalb eines Webspace. Linked Open Data macht dies möglich. Und so funktioniert es. Tim Berners-Lee, der Erfinder des World Wide Web, ersuchte uns, alle unsere Informationen in Form von Dokumenten ins Web zu stellen. Und das taten wir auch. Deshalb stellen heute eine Menge einzelner Webseiten eine Menge an Informationen zur Verfügung. Und dann hatte er die Idee, das World Wide Web weiterzuentwickeln, indem er uns nun aufforderte, unsere Informationen als Rohdaten ins Web zu stellen. Denn Rohdaten lassen sich leichter mit anderen Daten verbinden. Die dadurch entstandenen Verweise, sogenannte Links, ermöglichen es dem Benutzer nun, in ein ergiebiges Netzwerk von Informationen einzutauchen. Aber damit dies überhaupt möglich ist, müssen Sie 4 Dinge beachten. Punkt 1. Sie sollten Ihre Daten frei zugänglich machen. Wenn die Daten nicht lizenziert sind, können sie einfacher mit anderen Daten verbunden werden. Punkt 2. Sie müssen Ihre Daten auf eine bestimmte Weise zugänglich machen, nämlich so, dass die Links zu anderen Daten in ihrer einfachsten Form dargestellt werden. Und jeder dieser Links muss mittels des Resource Description Frameworks, kurz RDF, als Triple dargestellt werden, denn diese bestehen aus 3 Teilen. Und alle diese Triples werden aufeinander verweisen. Punkt 3. Wenn die Triple online gestellt werden, brauchen Sie natürlich auch eine eindeutige Adresse, einen sogenannten Uniform Resource Identifier. Punkt 4. Sie müssen dies gemäß des Standard Web Source Protocols HTTP online zugänglich machen. Und voilà, Ihre Linked Open Data Ressourcen können mit anderen Linked Open Data Ressourcen verbunden werden. So entsteht ein ergiebiges Netzwerk an Informationen, das bisher unentdeckte Links zum Vorschein bringt. Es wird also Wissen auf eine nie zuvor dagewesene Weise miteinander kombinieren. Nun, warum ist das Ganze für Sie interessant und was bringt es Ihren Benutzern? Wenn andere Daten durch Links auf ihre eigenen Daten verweisen, dann wird ihre eigene Webseite höher in Suchmaschinenergebnissen gelistet. Ihre eigenen Daten werden dadurch wertvoller und somit sichtbarer. Zusätzlich können Sie, aber auch andere, sehr einfache Anwendungen erstellen, die auf Ihren eigenen oder auf den Daten anderer aufbauen. Somit werden Sie als Gedächtnisinstitution einfacher im Web gefunden und können vollständigere Informationen anbieten. Und je brauchbarer Ihre Informationen für andere sind, desto mehr Besucher werden auf Ihrer Seite landen, desto mehr Traffic werden Sie auf Ihrer Webseite haben und desto besser werden auch Ihre Webstatistik und Ihre Leistungsindikatoren sein. Machen Sie also Ihre vertrauenswürdigen Metadaten jetzt als Linked Open Data verfügbar und werden Sie zu einer anerkannten Informationsquelle im Web. Wir glauben, dass sowohl Ihre Benutzer als auch Sie, die Gedächtnisinstitutionen, von Linked Open Data profitieren werden. Europeana schließt mit seinen Datenlieferanten einen Vertrag ab, das sogenannte Europeana Data Exchange Agreement. Ein zentraler Punkt dieses Vertrages ist die offene Lizenzierung der Daten, um diesen Prozess zu vereinfachen. Die Europeana Foundation und die Fachverbände der Gedächtnisinstitutionen befürworten und unterstützen den Einsatz von Open Data. Somit verleihen die Informationen, die Sie in Ihrer Institution zur Verfügung stellen, dem Web seine eigentliche Stärke und Qualität.
Ach so. It's very funny to see your faces looking across the screens. Makes me think of an American sports bar. Have you ever been to an American sports bar where you have screens all over? So, that's the start that I'd like to give you. I'm now going to talk you through how at Europeana we're thinking about business models and how we think we could evolve our business model over the future. Maybe could you tell me, just by raising your hand, how many of you have heard of Europeana? Yeah, it's quite a few people, that's good. How many of you contribute to Europeana? It's not quite enough. Yeah, but still good. Thank you. Ooh, this is the wrong slide, hold on. I'm at the end already. So I'm afraid it's quite visual, so you'll probably have to look at the screens quite a bit. So first, for those of you who don't know, who don't remember, the vision for Europeana was laid out as a political idea in 2008, and it was about what you see here. It's about openly accessible digital cultural heritage, and it had two components to it, which are sometimes in contradiction with each other, or at least it seems to be. It's about mutual understanding for cultural diversity, so it's a strong cultural component. But it also has in it the support for a thriving knowledge economy. So you already see the word economy being an intrinsic part of Europeana. How do we support growth, new jobs, new businesses being created? And how can we marry these two? Europeana is the collective endeavor of about 2,200 institutions, and after this meeting I'm sure you will increase that by joining us, who make their data available through a single point of access. Now it's important to note that what Europeana collects is not content. We currently collect metadata, previews and a link to the digital object in the institutions that hold the content. But in 2008, the important thing was to harmonize all this material, standardize the way we access it, and make it available through one interface, the portal europeana.eu. So for the largest part of 2008 and 2011, that's what we did. That's what we did together, and that's what we spent our effort on. An interesting point is that Germany is the largest contributor to Europeana, with over 3.4 million objects, or about 15.8% of the total. You'll hear me say a couple of these numbers during my presentation. So congratulations, that's fantastic. We hope to keep it up that way. You'll see through Europeana portal, for which you see the preview here. This is actually the first time that we show this. It's going live in a month, the new interface for Europeana.eu. You'll see various things. You'll see collections coming through cultural institutions, in this case a fantastic map of Berlin from the Zentralen Landesbibliothek in Berlin. But you also see material related to Berlin coming from completely different collections. So in this case, this fantastic photo from a guy called Max Dufek, one of my crazier countrymen, I think, who wanted to travel around the world on his hands, from the National Library of the Netherlands. And more we start collecting material from individual people, user-generated content or whatever we want to call that. What you see here was collected, it's a diary from the Europeana 1914-1918 project, and I believe you've heard about that yesterday. And it's interestingly, this is from the great-grandfather from Dr. Ziegler-Schmidt, who's starting up the German Digital Library. So all these things you can find in Europeana, and I think it's the connections that make it a really rich collection. So if you look at the business model, which I interpret as, like I said, the logic of value creation, what are the pluses and minuses of this? Europeana costs about 5 million euros a year to run. With that money, we standardize the metadata, we create the portal, we have about 6 developers in place, we have people in the marketing department. And the main benefits that we are being judged upon by you, by the European Commission, is the traffic to Europeana.eu. Now that translates to about 5 million visits a year currently. So if you make the equation, 5 million euros and 5 million visits a year, that's quite an expensive visit if you look at it that way. But it also, of course, creates lower startup costs for aggregation because of the knowledge exchange. We'll be able to do lots more with that. The main point is that the barriers for entry for reuse are still way too high in this model. So if you look at it as a whole, what value propositions do you have for the kind of stakeholders that you try to provide to? The main costs are in standardizing and the main benefits are in views on Europeana. It does not allow us to do some really important and interesting things. We can't redistribute through linked open data, the film that I just showed you, which has tremendous potential for research in my opinion. We can't collaborate with fast-moving sites like HistoryPin, and we can't even work with Pavel to exchange data on Wikipedia. So we thought hard about what can we do about it. What is the biggest barrier that we need to get rid of? And we started looking at this business model from a different perspective. So instead of looking at it from a very supply-driven way of looking, which is absolutely natural for the cultural institutions that we represent, we started looking, okay, what happens if we look more on the demand side, from the user perspective, things that Wikipedia is already way ahead of us from. What kind of channel should we open to make all this material available in a much more useful way? And we came to the conclusion that the licensing framework that we operate under is absolutely key to that. So whilst in our previous data exchange agreement, we worked with CC BY NC, non-commercial. We started a campaign to move that into a more open license. So on September 12th, we were very proud and happy to release all that data under a CC0 public domain waiver. Does that mean anything to you? You understand what that is? It's basically putting it back into the public domain. So with these 20 million records now freely available for reuse, why do we think that's significant? We think it's significant because A, it's the largest single dedication of cultural data to the public domain, but that by itself it doesn't mean anything. We're not here to get into the Guinness Book of Records. We think it's important because it's a strong statement that what was in the public domain should stay in the public domain. It's also important because it's a case study that we're capable of organizing massive change in Europe if we do it together. A year and a half ago, when we started this campaign, we met a lot of resistance, understandable resistance. It's about the debate that you'll be having here for the past day, and today it's about how much control are you prepared to give up, and what do you expect out of that. But we are able to do it. So what is the logic of value creation for open data is now the question that we're facing. So to do that, I'm going to show you a case study that we did on the business model for cultural institutions. What happens with a cultural institution's business model if you open up data? We found that all institutions perceived 3 main benefits and 3 main risks out of opening up data, and you need to balance that. So on the benefit side, everyone understands that if you open up data, you're likely to get more customers. I don't like the word customer in our context too much, but more people visiting your material is a likely outcome of this. It's also increasing the relevance of your institution. Everyone understands that if you keep the material locked into a vault, you're not a player in the digital arena, and that's not going to work for the long term. And it also is felt, and I think this was the strongest point, that it's part of our public mission. Cultural institutions usually are public funded, and making this material as widely available as possible is absolutely key to all this. Nevertheless, there are practical realities. And on the risk side, most institutions saw the following 3 risks. The first one, in business terms again, is unwanted spillover effects. Now, who understands what that means? Nobody. It basically means, why should I make my material available if others can profit from it? It's an interesting way of looking at things. The second one was the loss of attribution. What happens if I make my material widely available and nobody can trace it back to my institution, all the work that I did? And the third one is the loss of potential income. We could perhaps make money out of this. We don't know how to do it yet, but we could. So by and large, if you look at the very practical realities, and I absolutely don't underestimate that, it's a very tough economic climate. Digitization is hugely costly, so we need to find ways to make this work. So on face value, it seems like a negative equation. But there were 3 things that would make this equation alter to a more positive side. So these institutions told us that if we can come up with real-life examples of increased engagement, maybe application development, case studies that really work, that really show not only that individual users are increasingly happy, but it also translates back to value for my institution, that would make them happy. The second one is about critical performance indicators, or key performance indicators. The numbers we talked about, the 11 seconds per museum item. But if you can redefine performance indicators beyond visits to the institutional websites, then maybe we have some ground to stand on. Most museums still need to show the visits to their website as the most important indicator of success. But if you can show the amount of visits you received on Wikipedia, for example, and can count those as well, then maybe you have a much better value proposition. And the third one is about technical development, persistent identifiers, improved multilingual functionalities. If we solve a couple of important and very difficult technical issues, then maybe we have a better way to look at things. So we took all that to heart, and we think we were able to convince most of our institutions that they should release the data, the metadata, on a CC0 license. So what does that mean for the business model of Europeana? What kind of innovation do we see coming from that? The pluses and minuses of this business model. The cost of running Europeana can still be 5 to 7 million a year. It won't increase dramatically. But the main benefits will be extended to views on any websites, on apps developed and research improved based on this. And we should be able to translate that back to the cultural institutions. The barriers for entry for reuse are now, of course, much lower. So we think that if Europeana retransforms itself, repositions itself as a facilitator of innovation, much less than a provider of a portal, then we think that the equation will tremendously increase, that we have a much better proposition for you and for the European Commission and everyone who works with us. So what do we do? Because I think in the end, it's not about big visionary statements. It's about how do you make his work in practice. We launched a program, Hack for Europe, and we made the data available for developers. And a very interesting community of people, very engaged. These are technical people who have an interesting culture. And it's a group of people that we didn't have a very strong relationship beforehand. So we organized, I think up to now 11 hackathons, but we have more hackathons than we can handle these days. And out of those came about 75 prototypes. I'm going to show you a couple. This is the Europeana eCloud, which is a 3D rendering for a live experience on the 1480 material. So it's a huge screen that you have to have 3D glasses on, based on the Europeana API. And we show there all the material we've collected on the First World War. And you can browse and interact with it the way you can. Now, it has its limitations because it's a physical thing, but it was an incredibly interesting way of displaying the material. Then we had lots of apps. ArtSpace, which was developed in Poland. They make all the material available in your living room, but also in bus cabins, etc. And they have a whole system and a business model and a rights clearance method behind it that I think is waiting to be explored. Europeana was one of the latest that we did from Latvia, which works a little bit like Pinterest, which allows you to browse and interact completely differently with the material in Europeana. And Time Mesh, which has a historical overlay of pictures you take, for example, from the Reichstag, and then you see all the old images relating to that from Europeana coming out. It's a little bit like Layer, which some of you may have heard of. So all of these are examples of the things that can be done if we put our creative minds on the open data. And I think there's real value and possibilities there. But these were all only proofs of concept. We didn't further develop those. We will be continuing to organize hackathons, but hackathons by themselves only yield prototypes. How do you take that to the next level, to real downloadable applications on iTunes, for example? We think there are 4 conditions, and this is purely looking at it from the Europeana perspective, that need to be dramatically improved in order to really have commercial and social value coming out of that. The first one is that only 15% of available cultural objects are in Europeana, which comes from an Enumerate study that was recently released. Now that 15% comes out of only 20% digitized material from cultural institutions on average. So I think the potential for digitization is still huge, and we've only come to here. Only 60% of all items in Europeana have rights labels. Now I say only because that to us is critical. We respect copyright, and we're not only about open content, although I personally believe that that is the way for the future. But we respect copyright, and in order to be able to do that, we need rights labels for all the items that we collect. So that's a priority for us next year. Only 20% of the items contain geospatial information. Now, this is becoming more and more important with tablets and mobile phones. And finally, 60% of the items have good visual previews of the content. Now, you see, I use lots of images in my presentations. I think coming up with thumbnails this big is not good enough anymore. We need to have higher resolution images to be able to develop useful applications based on it. So all these 4 things are priorities for business development at Europeana for next year. Now what about the future? So we've seen Europeana transition from an aggregator, standardizing material, into a facilitator of innovation. But we think that's not the end station. I think we have lots of new ground to cover. So we're starting to rethink Europeana more as a collaborative space. It's not an institution or a repository where you bring your material and then hope to get something back. We need to organize it differently. So we think where Europeana can act as a real facilitator, working with the Open Knowledge Foundation, with Kennisland, a think tank in Holland, with Wikipedia and Google, to set up the standards that are necessary to create a real creative reuse environment, we would be in a much better place. So others will be able to build services on top of this. Those could be the cultural institutions that you represent, or it could be creative industries and tourism, or it could be the educational sector. We think that the impact on that will be tremendous. If we really collaborate together, then we'll be an infrastructure organization. We're discussing currently future funding for Europeana, which will come from the Connecting Europe facility. I won't get into the boring details of that, but it's transport, it's digital infrastructure, it's broadband. It's those type of things that we'll become a part of. We're the digital infrastructure for the future. And I don't mean we, the European office, I mean we as a collective. And I think that will finally lead us to real engagement, new business, jobs. It's a future we can envision. So this is my final. Love this quote, like truth, culture and creativity are enduring. I think we've been very good at enduring, we're good at preservation, but how to make that accessible in the most open way as possible is something that you need a real visionary, but also a very practical approach. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions to Verwayen?
Yeah.
What? John Weitzman.
Yes, thanks. I'm a lawyer here in Berlin, and I'm in touch with several institutions thinking about the stuff that you talked about. And I think you have two psychological problems here. One is that we had in a talk yesterday, not here but outside, that some institutions actually value their importance and their reputation by sitting on their vault and not opening it up. You said on your two-sided slide that it's a downside of not opening up, but these institutions actually value the fact that people have to come all the way from Asia to visit their institution to get access to the material. If you tell them, if you open it up, you're going to be more relevant, they just think you're crazy because they have a different view on being relevant. They measure it by the kind of efforts others have to take to get to their material. And what do you tell those? And the second one is, I met with several really progressive video artists in Berlin, and they thought about contributing to Europeana. And then they read the CC0 agreement, and they were asked to provide their metadata under CC0, and they said, wait, this is the only thing we have. This is what we put effort in, and we don't want this under CC0. So what do? They deliver some metadata, but they narrow it down to the minimum they have to deliver in order not to give it to Europeana. So what do you tell them?
Yeah. Yeah, two interesting. It's interesting you say it's psychological problems. I think they are. On the first one, which is about the relevance of the institution and the effort that people need to take to come to you. There's a very interesting example of a business model in the United States of an archive who says, you know, all my material is openly available. Anyone can download it for free, full content. But if you want to know and be assured that this material is cleared and is copyright free, etc., you need to buy a copyright statement from us. So I think there's still a tremendous amount of value for a researcher to know that the material is really coming from the institution who created the material and is assured that this material is cleared, is citable, etc. So I think people will then still come to you from India or the United States or wherever, but it extends the reach that you have for people who are less interested in that. So that, to me, is the psychological thing. And it's actually related to the second part about the video artists. And it's not only video artists, I think archives also have that psychological mind frame, that you diminish the amount of metadata that you give to a minimum. Yeah, I'm not completely thrilled about that. I think metadata should be openly available, and but if you look at it as a resource in itself, then I think that's an absolutely valid way of thinking. And to me, that it's in the same business model logic as saying for record companies these days, the music is available for free, but you'll still come to my concert and you'll pay 90 euros to get there. So the live experience, which isn't copyable, that's what you'll start paying for. So I think that's how video artists should also look at things.